Well, good morning, everybody. We're starting the meeting now in public and online. I'm Nick Dawson, the chair of the Integrated Care Board for the North East and North Cumbria, and this is our meeting on the 27th of January 2026. I'd like to welcome members of the public and also welcome the Chair and Chief Executive of County Durham and Darlington Foundation Trust, who are going to be joining us for agenda item 11. We're going to take that a little bit ahead of time. Alison Marshall and Steve Russell have travelled down in rather bad weather conditions, so to enable them to conclude a little bit earlier, we're going to do that. But for those listening watching online, the proceedings, of course, as usual, are being recorded. So if there's any item that you come on the line for a particular time, you would be able to catch up on it in the recording. So we have apologies for absence from Kelly Angus, Chief People Officer, and attending for her is Michelle Evans, Director of Workforce. Declarations of interest, you have the schedules of all of the members are in the public domain. I'd just like to draw attention to our Medical Director, Neil O'Brien, who has a family member working in County Durham Darlington Foundation Trust, but our Board Secretary has assessed the conflict and it doesn't preclude it from playing a full part in the discussion today. And then can we confirm that we're quorum? We are. Minutes of the previous board meeting held on the 25th of November 2025. Are there any points of accuracy that anyone wants to raise? No, so we can approve those. And then on the matters arising and the follow-up action log, are there any points anyone wants to raise there? No. Thank you very much. And then before we get properly started, does anyone want to add anything to the agenda or are there any items of other business that you'd like to propose that we consider? No. Thank you very much. So I propose that we have the Chief Executive's report and then we will move to item 11 on County Durham and Darlington Foundation Trust. So, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, our colleagues and those of us who are in attendance. To observe the board today and anybody who's watching online, I just want to start by recognising that today is, of course, Memorial Day. I think this provides us with an opportunity to both recognise the victims of Holocaust, but also to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility, particularly to tackle racism and intolerance when they occur. I think it's particularly important to highlight that at this time when we see a rise in both racism and religious hate crimes, and indeed the impact for particularly colleagues working within the health service. For example, we see a 5% increase in the numbers of contacts in Royal College of Nursing helpline for matters like this. You'll see, therefore, in my report, I've shared with you work that we've led on behalf of the North Yorkshire NHS region, particularly in making available anti-racism resources through our Boost website. We've had 23,000 users access that. That's available to all colleagues working in health and care, and indeed all of our local public and community and voluntary sector services. But I think particularly in terms of leaders working in health services, really important that we can continue our focus on anti-racism and addressing all forms of this where it occurs. In my report, I also give an update of the very significant change programme that we've got underway. And since our last board meeting, we have concluded a lengthy consultation with all of our staff on the proposed changes as we transition to become a strategic commissioning organisation. We are now going through a process whereby we are reviewing very detailed and helpful feedback. We've had over 1,000 pieces of feedback from our staff, and we'll bring back the final proposed structure for board approval in February. And between February and the end of April, we will implement that. We are seeing a number of staff exit the organisation through voluntary redundancy arrangements, and we have approved the first 100 departures on voluntary redundancy. We will be undertaking further targeted voluntary redundancy as we proceed through the appointments process to our structure. I think one of the things I just want to say on this change is it's more than just structural change. This is a fundamental reset in our goal as an organisation moving into strategic commissioning, where will be responsible for paying for the health services for 3.1 million people that live across the North East and North Cumbria. And in doing so, one of the things we are absolutely focusing on is how we strengthen our commissioning capability. So all of the functions through the commissioning cycle that support both the effective planning but also the purchasing of services and the quality monitoring of those services as well. But this is a very significant change across the English NHS system. But I'm really confident that as we move through the spring and into the summer months, we will deliver this transition within all the requirements that have been set for us nationally. Since our last board meeting, we've gone through the winter period, and I really want to commend all of our colleagues across the system for the way in which I think the detailed planning that you'll know that we always start our planning for winter in February, but I do think the planning that we put in place across the system, working with all our NHS partners, but also our local authority partners, and I do want to particularly mention our colleagues in our social care teams, has stood us in good stead. I think this winter we're able to demonstrate significant improvements across several indicators across the system, whilst also seeing an additional 3,799 calls made and a 7% rise in ambulances arriving at the emergency department. The improvements we achieved were in response times, and the North East Ambulance Service does still retain the #1 position for ambulance response times. And we also reduced the average handover time by 10 minutes, and half the number of ambulance handovers that exceeded 45 minutes across the system. So a really significant performance. I don't want that, though, to give the impression that it was easy. It has been incredibly difficult, I know, for our staff at particular moments through all of our services, but also in our community services, and again want to thank them on our behalf. In our report, and I think as a board, we've put a particular focus on our dental improvement strategy across the system. And I'm really delighted that I think we're the first ICB in the country where the public can now book urgent dental access via our website and also through NHS 111. And that's as a direct result of the 30 urgent dental access centres that we've commissioned right across the North East and North Cumbria. And this is particularly aimed at people who may have abscess, be in significant pain, had a broken tooth, and they need to access dental services in an urgent way. We are working to increase the communication of this. We want this to be known widely across the public, that they can access these services and that there is capacity available for them to access dental services in an emergency. Obviously, the usual NHS dental charges do apply, but I'm really delighted that this is a really significant improvement right across the system. I think, needless to say, the way in which our services were able to respond to winter is also as a direct result of all the preventative work that we've done through the vaccination campaign. And while, in spite of a slow start in the autumn, we did achieve over 50% of our frontline health workers being vaccinated. And for COVID, we exceeded our target, particularly for some of the most vulnerable parts of our community,
our care home residents, with the uptake at just under 70%, and for the over 75s, the uptake at over 63%. I think that's a real achievement to our community pharmacists, all of our teams working across general practice and community services, really targeting our vaccinations at our most vulnerable. Chair, I know that we'll come on to talk to our colleagues who have joined us today from County Durham and Darlington, but in my report I do want to just briefly mention the further work that we've been undertaking right across the system with our NHS organisations, particularly around the use of limited liability partnerships and material subcontractors. As the Commissioner of Services, there is the expectation in the NHS standard contract that where organisations that we buy services from enter into these arrangements, that they do need to notify us of them, and that their boards also need to ensure that they've got appropriate oversight and assurance mechanisms. I think the learning that our colleagues will talk about from County Durham and Darlington has enabled all of our foundation trusts, I think, to review these arrangements and particularly strengthen them where required. And we continue to test this through our regular contract meetings with organisations. And then, Chair, if I just made two final points. I touched on the improvements in our ambulance services, and particularly our North East Ambulance Service being the top performer, particularly around their category 2 response rates. I had the real pleasure of joining the Chief Executive of the Ambulance Service out on the welfare car recently. We spent a few hours at the entrances to a couple of our large hospitals in the system, and it provided a real opportunity for me to talk to paramedics, but also a whole range of colleagues who work in the ambulance service. And I was really blown away, I think, by their focus and their commitment to the patients that they serve, but also listening to them talk about the improvements they're making. I had the opportunity also to hear about how technicians can progress to become paramedics, and in fact the demand in place for a relatively small number of training places across the system. It really made me reflect and think about the role our ambulance service has, not just in terms of responding to emergencies, but the potential that they can play, particularly in neighbourhood health services and preventing people actually getting to hospital. And in fact, most of our the colleagues I met who work on ambulances talked about most of their work being in the community and not just the blue light work that they do going to hospitals. But I think we should be really proud of the service that we've got here, the staff that work in it, and it was good to see that firsthand. And then just finally, I started the week last week at Wylam Brewery with our colleagues from Northumbria Police. I wasn't there for social purposes. Unfortunately, it was Blue Monday, and we had a lot of focus on Blue Monday, and working closely with our colleagues in the police service, we named this Operation Blue Monday, and it had a really very serious purpose, and that was to talk about suicide prevention. And we talked about bringing suicide out of the shadows, but also how suicide is all of our business. We know, for example, most people who do end their lives by suicide, sadly, have never come into contact with a specialist mental health service, or indeed been able to access any mental health services. So this is a real shared endeavour right across our communities, and it was really positive to see many members of our community and voluntary sector, our NHS Trust and other statutory partners coming together to put the real focus on suicide prevention and indeed the actions that we need to take on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Sam. Questions and comments for the Chief Executive on her report? Jacqueline Myers.
Thanks, Salim. I think, Sam, maybe we just want to highlight the inclusion of the Emergency Planning, Resilience and Response report there, which is an appendix to your report. There isn't anything significant to note in relation to it, but it does require the approval of the board. So hopefully board members will be familiar with the report. I think it's the 4th time we've brought the annual report, and they'll be pleased to see the slow but steady progress we've made over the years, which has reached us for the first time to substantial compliance. So I wanted to recommend that for approval by the board, and I'm happy to take any questions if there are any. Thanks, Chair.
Let's just take that before we come back to questions on other areas. Does anybody have any questions for Jacqueline on the emergency preparedness, resilience and response matter? And are you happy to approve that, having read it in advance? Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments or questions for Sam? Sir Pally Hungin.
Thank you very much for your the report, Sam. I just wondered if you had any general comments on the evolution of the ICB, the ICS here and nationally, and if you're prepared to speculate around how we might look, say, in 6 months or even a year.
Great question. And I think this is very much the subject of a lot of discussion and debate. And in fact, I started the week, Sir Pally, with colleagues, peers, other chief executives and a number of integrated care boards. We've come together to develop a strategic commissioning network to share practice and also provide peer support as we make this transition. I think the thing that's really clear is the strategic commissioning function is a requirement, and in terms of what I hear nationally is this will remain a requirement in the health system. There is the need for an organisation to act as the payer for healthcare services. Having said that, we'll be a much smaller organisation, focused far more strategically and looking at whole population health and prevention. And indeed, the conversations we've been having locally, both with our NHS trusts, and we have Ken here today representing the Provider Collaborative, and our local authority partners, has been around the place leadership now really being delivered by those organisations. So I think as we progress through the year, our focus will be on commissioning, setting service specifications, being clear on the outcomes that we seek from services, and really I think advancing our work around quality monitoring and ensure that we're getting the right outcomes and addressing the variation in outcomes where they occur.
If I could just add, some of the discussions I've been having with Sam and Jacqueline is to, because we will be focusing on commissioning particularly, but we're doing it on behalf of 3 million people, not all of whom are patients, but many will become patients, trying to get the best service for them, whilst having an eye on ensuring the money's well spent as well. So I think that's going to mean, and I know the teams are already working on this, getting more information in a form that the public can easily understand. It's been a bit technical and turgid in the past in the NHS, but being able to let people see where it would be best to go, not just based on our judgment as commissioners, but giving them information where they can make the comparisons themselves about standards of care and outcomes of care in different places. Saira Malik, partner member.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Sam, for your report. So I just had 2 observations. Firstly, I'd like to thank you for the work that you're doing on the anti-racism teaching and training across our region, with more than 1 in 4 of our workforce being from an ethnic minority background. I think it's really important that we as a board show that we are prepared to commit to psychological safety, and I think your paper very neatly captures that. The other point I wanted to touch upon was the vaccines. So obviously the flu and vaccines, as we have done a lot of work on this across our region, the uptake was still around 50%, and that was particularly in our workforce as well, and obviously that's the time that we really need our workforce the most. So I guess there's lessons in this for us for next year, isn't there? And I look forward to seeing the work that we do to try and increase that uptake to protect our patients.
And if no other comments, if I could just, there isn't a chairman's report, so I'll just add my comments into the chief executive. Just to mention that working with our chief nurse, Hilary Lloyd, we're having a special initiative to try and make a major impact on the levels of healthcare infection in the region, and we're bringing World Health Organization experts in to help us in that. So we'll give a fuller report in due course, but the initiative has been planned now and will be rolling out quite soon. So if we could now move on, please, to item 11, to the item that Alison Marshall, Interim Chair, and Steve Russell, Chief Executive, County Durham and Darlington Trust, are attending for, and we're very grateful to them both for joining us this morning. We had a public discussion when the investigators' report, the Aubrey report, first came out, and on the same day the Trust also had a public meeting to discuss the report. But things have moved on since then. A lot of work's been undertaken to progress not just the recommendations in the report, but other matters that have come to light during the time that Alison and Steve have been in post. And I should emphasise that both of them came into post after the events that are described in the report. So it's a good opportunity for us in the public part of the meeting to hear about the work that you've been doing, for which we'd like to thank you. And there's been a lot of teamwork, conscious of the respective roles of NHS England and their regional office and the ICB. We've been working closely with the Trust to give as much support as we can and continue to give support as and when it's required. So you're going to make some introductory presentation and then we'll move into questions and comment. Alison.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Alison Marshall. I'm the Interim Chair at County Durham and Darlington Foundation Trust, and I'm here with Steve Russell, our Chief Executive, this morning. We want to look at the failures in our breast service and the findings of the Aubrey report in relation to leadership and governance that addresses what happened in those services. But before we go into that, Steve and I feel very strongly that we need to start with an apology. Apology to the patients, to the families, to the carers that we've let down. They put their trust in us to come to us and get high quality care and compassion, and some of those women did not receive that, and we are truly sorry that that is the case. We've also let our staff down, so some of our staff wanted to speak up, felt that they were unable to do so. Some of our staff did speak up and weren't listened to, so we'd like to apologise to them as well. And we're determined to make sure that this doesn't happen again, and part of that is about being very open and transparent about what happened and what we're doing about it. And in that context, we very much welcome the opportunity to have this discussion with you today. There's a lot of learning for the system as a whole that I think needs to be shared as widely as we can. So that's the background to where we are and why we welcome being here. If I can just pick up on the Chair's point about the support that we've had, we have had some great support from the ICB and from NHSE in the last few months, and we'd just like to acknowledge that as well. So I'm going to hand over to Steve, who's going to take you through the presentation.
Thanks, Alison. Morning, everybody. Hello, my name's Steve. I'm the Chief Exec at County Durham and Darlington, as Alison's said. Like Alison, I won't repeat the apology Alison has given, but just to say, probably the same for a number of colleagues around the table and indeed across our organisation. Reading the Aubrey report and absorbing the magnitude of it has been one of the hardest things ever in my 28 years in the NHS. And that is, if it's hard for me, it's even harder for many of our staff, and it's even harder for our patients and our communities. And as Alison has said, there's a very significant challenge ahead of us, but we are absolutely determined and resolute to make improvements for our patients, our communities, and our staff. So what we thought we would do, recognising you'll have lots of areas you want to discuss with us, we thought we'd just talk through, remind colleagues of the headline findings of the review that Mary Aubrey undertook. Alison will talk about some of the areas where we've already taken action in strengthening the board, because a lot of this was about leadership and culture. And then I will run through a brief update on some of the actions that we've taken to date. And then we'll touch briefly again on the status of the breast service and some of the improvements that have been made. And then, as Salim said, there are a number of other areas of challenge that we'll just reflect on at the end. So, colleagues will have seen this. As Salim said, you covered a bit of this in your board meeting, as did we. We've talked really openly, or we've tried to talk really openly about this within the organisation. That has been both challenging and positive for staff. Some staff have found this really hard and have gone through a range of emotions, and they've talked quite openly to Alison, to myself and to other colleagues in the organisation, which is important in and of itself, because, as I say, a lot of this has been about culture. So not to dwell on this too much, but to frame the discussion, the Aubrey report found a number of very significant failings at the Trust in terms of oversight and accountability. So there were repeated warning signs and the organisation didn't act on those as quickly as we should have done. The governance systems that you would expect to try and keep patients and staff safe within the organisation weren't as effective as they should have been, and didn't lead to the issues being sufficiently exposed, understood and acted upon. And importantly, there was a really significant lack of curiosity in the organisation. That is a word that that is openly discussed now and openly used in a very different way in CDFT. And as I've said, the report found a lack of focus on quality in the culture of the organisation, and overly focused on finance and performance standards. The report also found some specific issues that I'm sure we'll want to talk about in the way that doctors in particular were both managed and supported through the appraisal process, the job planning process, and in how some colleagues were appointed into consultant roles without being on the specialist register. And then finally, there was a theme around the financial governance arrangements. Salim and Tam both touched on this, but the Trust had used extensive outsourcing and extensive use of limited liability partnerships, where there were significant conflicts of interest that weren't properly managed. So I know you're very familiar with that, but I think it's worth just grounding where we are and the areas that we're trying to focus on. So I think Alison's just going to talk through actions to strengthen the board, and then I'll do a little bit more.
So it became very clear with the Aubrey report that there were issues with leadership and culture at the board level. But also one thing that was very noticeable when we came in was the size of the board. The board was very small in terms of the execs and non-execs, five each plus the chair. That's really small. It's the smallest in our ICB region. So the first thing we did, looking ahead at sort of capability and capacity, was to increase the number of execs and non-execs in our constitution. There had been a practice looking at the non-exec side in the organisation of sort of breeding non-execs from the Council of Governors, and then those non-execs becoming chairs as well. And there's just that system leads to a lack of independence, and there was a need to address that with the Council of Governors and across the board. So we have just recently, with the help of Saya on our panel, appointed 5 new non-exec directors. So once they all arrive, in a few months' time, we'll have 2 of the original non-exec directors and 5 new ones. The appointment process in relation to that, we were really pleased with the quality of the applicants that we've got. We've got some really heavyweight non-execs in there. I don't think they will ever be accused of not being curious and not being challenging, but also supportive to the executive team. We've also just appointed a deputy chief executive. We do have some interim executives on our board, interim medical director, and interim chief nurse, and interim chief finance officer, and we'll be moving in the next few months towards making some permanent appointments in relation to the executive side as well. We've also looked at the board committee structures. The board committees weren't really undertaking their proper function, I would say. They weren't, well, it's that challenge and that curiosity again. So we've particularly set up a People and Culture Committee to look at the cultural issues and the people issues, some of which Steve's already touched on, across the organisation. That used to sit as part of an overall committee that also had finance and performance in it. So we've now separated out those two disciplines to get a much better grip. And again, our new non-execs are helping in relation to chairing some of our committees moving forwards. So quite a bit of work over a relatively short period of time in relation to that. We've also had Governwell come in, which is the governor side of NHS providers. They've come in to help work with the governors. As I say, that because of the nature of that progression from governor to non-exec to chair, that the governors have found themselves more in a position of being treated like non-execs and acting like non-execs. The information that they've been given and the way it's been given to them has encouraged them down that line. So we're just explaining the role to the governors and making sure that they're carrying out their role, bringing their voice from the communities to our board table, because listening is going to be a very big part of what the board needs to do over the next few months and years. So that's what we've done at board level. Pass back over to Steve.
Thanks, Alison. So on the day that we published the Aubrey report, we also published our response, setting out the areas where we intended to make improvements over 3 sort of time horizons. And again, I'll just briefly run through those. They'll be familiar to many colleagues. So the first area is leadership and corporate governance for obvious reasons. Part of what we've sought to do, these are easy words to say, and of course the impact will be felt over time, but is to reset the tone within the organisation and to be really clear about what our priorities are. And so we've been very explicit that quality is our organising principle, outcomes for patients and their families are what matters, and securing that in a value for money way and listening to our staff is where our focus is, and we're being quite relentless in that for obvious reasons. Shafi and Jill, who Alison's referred to, who are interim medical director and chief nurse, are really bringing a much sharper and stronger focus on quality across the organisation in a very visible way, which is important, as well as supporting all of the work on our systems and processes to make sure we've got the right governance. We're trying very hard to listen to our staff. We've opened up lots of different channels to try and do that. We now run a weekly half-hour all staff teams session just to check in with colleagues and to let them ask us any questions that they are on their mind. Quite a number of colleagues through that forum and through others have got in touch and asked to come and talk to me or Shafi or Jill about their experiences and their concerns, and that's a really valuable and important set of feedback. And alongside that, as Alison said, we've tried to strengthen the board committees, and we're trying to strengthen the management committees and groups that support that way of working. To help us with the revised governance arrangements, governance can sound dry sometimes, but it's really, really important. And we've got 2 board advisors, Margaret Kitchen and Hugo Massey-Taylor, who've got experience in these areas, who are supporting us to make changes. Alongside that, our clinical governance arrangements are in need of quite significant focus. So I think it's really important to say, as I say these things, when I'm talking about what we're doing, it is work in progress. It is absolutely not job done. And this is an area of particular focus for us. Margaret has helped us do a review of our board toward governance, and that has helped us identify some quite significant areas that we need to improve on. We've got a governance chart. It looks fine on a page, but in real life, it doesn't work as intended. And particularly importantly, there's a gap in what I think we would describe as specialty level governance, so services. So breast service is one example, general surgery would be another. The governance arrangement sort of started a bit higher up at kind of a care group level, which means there's a very significant missing piece, and then connecting into wards and departments as well. So we've developed a proposal about how we'll address that. That's been through our senior leadership team, and we'll start to implement that over the coming months. That includes a different way of us identifying and managing risk. Some of these things will feel like small issues, but they're important. So that will see frontline clinical teams being able to identify and highlight risk to the organisation in an unfettered manner, whereas before it had to go through a set of approvals. Now, it is very easy to say we will roll out training and support. I would stress to you, I think you would probably stress to us actually, this is a very significant change for our staff and for our ways of working, and they will need support and coaching and development to start to work in this way, and also to trust that the information that they share will be acted on. This is almost the most important slide, because all of what we're talking about sits in the context of culture, and this will be, we'll make improvements, I hope, and I believe we already are, but this is a medium to long-term journey. Changing the culture of an organisation doesn't happen overnight, as colleagues around the table well know. But it's something that our People and Culture Committee will pay very close attention to. We've engaged some board, exec team and wider senior team leadership development as part of trying to reset the culture. And importantly, one of the things we're trying to make sure we do is be very visible. You can do so much in an office or in a boardroom. Actually being alongside staff, listening to them and working with them, you see a completely different world, and they tell you all sorts of things. Alison and I learned a huge amount as we tottered around over Christmas and New Year, and continue to do so. And we're starting a bunch of roadshows in the places that our staff work later in February and into March to understand people's issues and priorities. And over time, we want to change the way that we work. We've been a really top-down command and control organisation. We need to move to being a much more clinically led organisation where people are much more autonomous. But again, that will take some time. In terms of the finding on how we recruited, supported and managed some clinical staff, so particularly this focus is on colleagues known as locum consultants, and the Trust had previously recruited a number of colleagues into those roles who were not on the specialist register. That had been a practice that existed for some time, as it appears. So we've made changes to the process for recruiting colleagues. So for a while now, only colleagues who have a CCT or are within 6 months of getting a CCT can be appointed. The appointment panel and the process is different and much stronger, and would reflect what you would all be used to in a kind of more standard AAC approach with college input, or at least somebody acting as college advisor if there isn't a college assessor there. And we are working through changes to the appraisal and job planning process. Some of those issues are local, and some actually there's possibly some learning nationally, and particularly in terms of how medical appraisal is structured for senior medical staff. And we are also conscious that it's important that the public know who is looking after them. And so we are working through this week a process and approach to make sure that only people who are consultants have the title consultants. And we're going through a process of consulting with colleagues who are impacted by this to amend titles as appropriate, whilst making sure we also have supporting colleagues who want to progress through the CSER route. And then finally, in terms of the response to the report, we have made a number of changes to the way in which contracts are entered into and overseen. That was largely done in a very devolved way in the past. We've made the process much stronger. We've terminated all bar one of the LLP arrangements. The one LLP arrangement we have left has much stronger management over it, and there is strong quality governance over the arrangement. And as Sam said, we've We've worked through all of the major contracts that we think we have with other parties, whether that's radiology reporting or echo, etc., and have made sure that they've got some clinical governance arrangements in place. And one of our board committees, the Quality Committee, is taking oversight of that. I thought it would be helpful, I'm conscious probably people want to get onto questions, but I thought it was important just to reflect on where the breast service is now, given that whilst the Aubrey report was triggered by the issues in breast, the findings are across the organisation and therefore relevant to other services. But I think it's important that we just briefly touch on this. So colleagues will be aware that we are working through reviewing the care of women who had surgery in the Trust between 2023 and 2025. That process is supported by 4 external reviewers, and we're looking to add a couple more reviewers to try and improve the pace that we're able to achieve. That review is covering just short of 1,500 women, and about 300 of those, just over 300, have been completed. To date, a total of 51 women we've identified as experiencing moderate or severe harm through their care, and we have been trying to support those women in understanding what happened, but also in being clear about their options going forward, both in terms of any additional care clinically, any psychological support, and other avenues that they may wish to pursue with us. You'll be aware that we had a helpline set up. We've had about 500 calls through that. Just short of a couple of hundred were after the publication of the report and the BBC programme. As I've mentioned, that review is currently focused in a specific time period, and we know that it is important that we continue to complete those reviews as promptly as possible. We're not, I think Alison and I both feel that we want to try and add further capacity and also some additional support and specialist expertise to try and triage cases so we can move through the review process more quickly, because it's difficult for women to be contacted and advised that we're reviewing their care and then there to be a period of time before we get back to them. We are also working carefully with colleagues on whether that period should be extended, and that is that there's a range of considerations that need to be taken into account. We've got some clinical advice. The patient voice will be really important in that context. And so we've done some work to agree a methodology about how we might arrive at that decision. And that's going to go to the oversight meeting that I think we have colleagues from some around this table and others on the 16th of February to try and again progress that for people. I wanted to just touch briefly on some of the changes that have been made to the breast service, and you'll see on the slide there that we've reviewed some of the outcome measures associated with the breast service. You'll be well aware of some of the issues that led to poorer outcomes for women. For some time now, surgery has been undertaken by the 2 new oncoplastic surgeons that were appointed into the Trust with a much stronger MDT, and we've had the support of an external breast surgeon from Newcastle Hospitals. And a range of changes have been put in place, and what that has led to is improvements in some of the key outcome measures. So many more women are receiving breast conserving surgery, which is important. Many more women are being offered immediate reconstruction, and many fewer women are having to have reoperation or re-excision. And you can see from the numbers on the chart, numbers on the slide, that those outcome measures are moving much closer to the expected standards that GIRFT would set for breast surgery. It's important to just again emphasise that we've got psychological support in place for women as appropriate. That's provided both by a specialist team internally from clinical psychology, but we've also got a number of senior nurses who provide quite they're in touch with women very regularly who want to remain in touch with the Trust. And a number of the matrons who've been supporting the Look Back programme try and support the women who want to maintain contact on a regular basis. Alison and I wrote to all of the women who had been identified as having significant lapses in care and experiencing harm when at the time of the publication of the report, and we've offered to meet women who wish to do so, and we've met a number of women over the last few weeks and are continuing to do so, and that is very important and helpful to us to hear their experience, but also an opportunity for women who we have let down, as Alison said, to share things that they wish to say to us. And then the final thing I was going to just say is that is quite a significant set of work that we need to engage in, that we're very committed to. However, the Trust has a number of other challenges that faces it. So we've had a recent CQC inspection in surgery. We have had a well-led inspection. We expect to get that report sometime in February. Out of those 2 inspections, some immediate feedback was given to us on areas that we need to focus on. We've had 2 Section 29A warning notices highlighting particular issues. They're not inconsistent with what's in the Aubrey report, but again, it emphasises the breadth and scale of the challenge. And so, alongside a number of the existing areas for quality and safety in the Trust, and also value for money, because we have a significant financial challenge, the board has asked us to make sure we pull all of this into one single plan, so that we're not trying to manage 14 different plans into different time horizons and different scales. So we've had a go at that. We've done a bit of a workshop with the board, and we'll start to report on that and the progress on that in the next board meeting. So I'll stop there, because that's probably quite enough, and I'm sure you'll have loads of things you want to ask us.
Well, thank you very much, Alison and Steve. It's a very clear and comprehensive presentation, and thank you very much for coming and telling us about the work that you're doing. It's obviously an extremely complex and long-standing set of problems that you're dealing with, but you've made it clear that your work or your insights go more widely than the breast cancer service. So obviously that makes it more complex, but it also makes it much more thorough to be able to look at quality and safety across the board. And you've also made it clear that the dysfunctions and lack of openness and lack of accountability applied to both the organisational culture as a whole, but the clinical culture as well. And obviously there's a lot of overlap between those 2 things, but some of the issues in each are very different and particular. So we'll throw it open now to members of the ICB board to make comments and ask questions. Who'd like to start? Yeah, Neil O'Brien, Chief Medical Officer.
Hi, morning. So a couple of questions from me. Again, I'm very interested in the improvements that you're making around the management of doctors. I think it's really important that the public have confidence in the training of the consultants that they see, and the Aubrey report does describe there was 40 plus consultants, I think, that were in the position where they didn't have recognised completion of specialist training, yet they were in those posts. Really good to hear that you're tackling that and improve recruitment processes. I guess my question is around those existing 40. And you said that this week you're going to be looking at ensuring that job nomenclature is corrected. So it's just really on some definite timescales for that, so that we can all be assured that people who are practicing as a consultant have the recognised specialist training.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. Yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's 43 colleagues. So if I could answer this question in 2 parts. The first is some of the colleagues in that group are seeking to get onto the specialist register. So we've gone through each colleague and understood where they are in terms of the portfolio pathway and how close they are to completion or otherwise. A number have already submitted, and when when we published our initial response to the document, to the report, we said we would work through with each individual where they were at and identify whether we could, whether they were sufficiently close to the end of the portfolio pathway, the sort of usual 6-month type thing, as it were, and then for those others who were further behind to agree a plan, and for those who are not going to complete the portfolio to agree an alternative set of arrangements. The consultation on naming will sort of run alongside that. It's likely to be 14 to 30 days in terms of the consultation that we need to do, because whilst it is both important that we address it, we'll just have to recognise that colleagues have been employed in a certain way.
Thank you. Hilary Lloyd, Chief Nurse.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for your presentation. It's some good progress there, and thank you for detailing the improvement work in a really clear way. My question is, for women living in the area, if they did need breast services within County Durham and Darlington hospitals, what assurance can you give that their care will be safe?
Thanks, Hilary. So again, in part of our response, we set out some of the immediate changes that had been made. The women who are referred into the service at the moment can expect the same standards in terms of the range of options and the diagnostic approach that would be taken in the One Stop Breast Clinic as in other hospitals across the region. So there's been a whole range of changes around making sure the triple assessment that you would expect in a one-stop clinic is done in the right way. The appointment structures have been changed to make sure women flow through the assessments in the right order, they see the right professionals. If they need the diagnostic tests, they are done on the appropriate standard of kit, and that they get the right type of diagnostic test, so ultrasound guided, image guided core biopsy as an example. And women who need, so the MDT has got external input. We've got both external breast surgeon and radiologist input into the MDTs to support decision making. And where women need surgery, that's being undertaken by the 2 new surgeons, as I've said. And I think hopefully some of the outcome measures would give women confidence that from an outcome perspective, the service has changed quite significantly.
Thank you. Mike Smith, partner member. As you know, Mike is a Durham GP.
Hi, Bob. Thank you for your presentation, and it does sound like there's some really positive improvements being made. My concern is just regarding some of the potentially entrenched behaviours in staff members in the organisation who've been there for decades potentially and have become accustomed to that focus on finance and performance at the expense of quality. Within such a large organisation, there are inevitably silos that don't interconnect very much with other parts of the organisation. And in essence, how can you be confident, and how will you be able to know that all of those parts of the organisation are making the relevant improvements, recognising that they may themselves not speak up and say that our quality is bad. They may believe everything's fine, and they simply just don't know how to say that. How will you observe that and intervene?
Thanks for the easy question. So part of it is about culture and being clear about our intentions around being open and listening. Part of it is also being actively curious, not just reactively curious. And so part of the work that we did early on, we need to revisit and strengthen this, but was to try and identify, to your point on silo working, where there might be teams that had similar features to the breast service. So where there was small teams, where there were team behaviour issues between colleagues, and where there was low turnover or low or high turnover. So that's a sort of necessary but not sufficient way of doing it, but we have done that. That has identified a couple of services that we are considering further. I'm happy to talk about it more if that's helpful. But we have also gone through services, I guess. So there are a number of departments, if you like, where I think we have identified some potential particular cultural challenges that, again, we are trying to work through in a systematic manner. The way that I think we need to try and tackle this more generally is to bridge the divide that has existed between clinicians and managers. So I've met some fantastic clinical colleagues and non-clinical colleagues. Pretty much all of the clinicians have said that they have felt completely disengaged from the senior leadership of the organisation and want to re-engage, but want us to change. And that doesn't happen overnight, but the point on being a very clinically connected organisation, I think, is a additional route to that point.
Thank you very much indeed. Claire Riley, Chief Corporate Services Officer and a Durham resident, I believe.
Yes, I am. So I definitely have a stake in this. And it's really encouraging to hear of the improvements being made, but also the emphasis on listening to staff and patients. It's also important to build trust and confidence in the local community, recognising as a Durham resident, I know that patients are actually still accessing care and getting good care in certain aspects, and I certainly had a family member recently who has done that. So the question for me is, how do you continue to listen to the public or to patients and staff whilst building trust and confidence in services that people are already accessing? And one final point as well is making sure that it's not just focused on patients and staff, it's also focused on community, because that community engagement will actually help you build those relationships back up.
Yeah, thanks, Claire. So I think in terms of our culture and our systems and processes to listen to the voice of patients and communities, I mean, we've got a way to go. Is the honest answer. We've done some stuff. Made some changes around joining teams structurally and so on. But again, if you just took an example of complaints and the way in which I think Alison and I have observed how we have dealt with complaints in the past, I would say that has been far too defensive. We've taken too long to respond to people, and we haven't answered their questions. And many people, I've met a number of complainants, as Alison, who wanted to talk about the process and their experience. And there's a common theme, which is around being curious and answering their question directly. And I think we've had a bit of a culture, I wouldn't say we've changed this yet, of trying to find the reason to say, well, there was nothing wrong with what happened, rather than where something has gone wrong, just being honest about it and just saying sorry really quickly and then trying to make amends for it. That's really what patients want in that set of circumstances. So we've got quite a lot to do culturally on that. We've in terms of trying to build the trust and confidence, which is both sort of being honest about where we are, but also celebrating success. I think we've been cautious about that because this was a really significant set of failings. And whilst there are many really good examples of care across the organisation, people write to me, they write to Alison quite often saying, I know you've got a challenge over here, but can I just tell you how fantastic my care was? And they name staff. We share that with them. But we've tried to strike quite a careful balance, and we've been quite cautious, I think, in trying not to overly celebrate in the context of a significant failing. Hopefully, as we demonstrate that we're making some of the improvements, we'll be able to do that in a more structured and overt way, because it's really important for the staff. It's really important to give people hope and also to give the community hope as well. So we probably haven't done as much as we should, is the honest answer.
Thank you. David Chandler, Chief Finance Officer.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Obviously, quality and safety are the utmost importance. But if I can ask just a couple of finance questions, if that's okay. So The Aubrey report highlighted some shortcomings around financial and contractual arrangements in the trust, including oversight and conflicts of interest, especially around LLP arrangements. And I was really pleased that, you know, you shared with us some of the improvements around governance in that area. And you touched on processes being stronger. There is only one LLP in place now. And the quality, which I was really pleased to hear, but you talked about quality being sort of embedded or interlinked into arrangements. So I suppose my question is, you know, how can you assure us that even, say, in the future, in a year's time, when we're thinking, oh, we might need to use some of our arrangement for service expansion or covering a shortfall, that we can be assured that similar issues won't arise in future around conflicts of interest or quality not being at the heart of those arrangements? So that's the first, hopefully a relatively specific question, which you have already touched on some of that already, I know you have. I'm probably just seeking a little bit more if that's okay. And the second one, you touched on, Steve, near the end, about some of the financial and other challenges that you face in the organisation. I just wonder if you can just share with us what your approach is going to be there in terms of ensuring value for money and especially financial sustainability in the trust going forward. Thank you.
Another easy question. Thanks, David. So on conflicts of interest, we have quite a robust process now in the procurement function where before a contract is entered into, there's a process to require colleagues to very specifically set out conflicts of interest. That does require people to engage in that, obviously. But we've taken quite a firm stance within the trust, and clinicians are clear about this, that we are not going to use LLPs that are owned by our own staff. And I don't intend for us to row back on that for a considerable period of time. There are LLP arrangements across the NHS and probably in the region that can and do work, but you need the right culture and safeguards around them, and we've demonstrated that we didn't have those. So for a not insignificant period of time, we're just not even entering into a discussion about it. And where we do use the insourcing arrangements, again, we are trying to strengthen we haven't really got a commercial function, so we're trying to strengthen the commercial function so that we actually properly manage contracts. That's important for this, but it's also just more important generally from a value for money perspective, whether it's a clinical arrangement or a non-clinical one. We're just debating how much of that we do on our own versus how much we might do with other colleagues, because it's quite a specialist set of skills. And then if I turn to your value for money question, so we're obviously going through the process at the moment of trying to develop the plan for next year. We've already got quite a lot of information about where we have value for money challenges. So we've got good data from Model Hospital and so on and so forth. Some of those are probably easier to address in the shorter term. Some of them will probably take like service model change. So we've said as a board that we need to refresh and develop a clinical strategy because we don't have one. There's a set of strategies that sort of come to an end in March. So we're intending to refresh and redevelop our clinical strategy, two-phase process, diagnostic, and then clinicians developing the response to that to identify how we can become sustainable over a period of time. The scale, I mean, you know this better than me, David, the scale of the challenge is not insignificant, and it's likely to take a number of years for us to address that, but that's the approach we're taking.
Thank you, David. Members of the public may not understand this concept of the LLP. Would you just explain what it is and what the concerns were in the report about it?
Yes, an LLP will be a limited liability partnership. So it's a separate organisation that's set up basically to receive services on behalf of whoever's contracted with it. And some of the concerns in the report, there was two probably main ones. So the first one was there were issues around the procurement of those services following proper regulatory procurement processes in terms of how do you let a contract of that nature and ensuring it's done in a fair and transparent way. And the second one, which was in the report, was about actually this was a significant loss-making LLP for the trust in terms of how it was commissioning those services, in terms of the income it was receiving, how much it was spending, and it was felt there was a lack of curiosity, shall we say, or oversight in terms of those contract arrangements. But I don't want to overemphasise the financial side here because I think it's the quality side.
No, but the concern was that some of the clinical services were outsourced and there wasn't proper oversight of what was happening with the patients.
Yes, absolutely. That's my understanding in terms of the report. On a number of fronts, but it wasn't just that. But I'm sure Steve could say
thank you. Okay, Rajesh Nadkarni. Rajesh is the medical director of our Northern Mental Health Trust.
I thank Steve and Alison. One of the things I was pleased about was on your slides, you mentioned that the medical director and nurse director are going to be collective in their leadership and how they take, the quality agenda forward, which is, I assume, a change from how it was before. So that's great. I was also pleased about the number of areas you're focused on from a cultural perspective, and you're clearly doing things around them. My question was about the governance arrangements. Pleased to know that the culture is now going to sit in the People and Culture Committee. We all know that when you often discover, sadly, in the health service, closed cultures after the significant harm has happened. But to be proactive, you really need to have a clear understanding of effectiveness and outcomes, because sometimes even patient experience might not help us in real closed cultures. So how does the People and Culture Committee really work with the Quality and Effectiveness Committee to make sure that we can be much more proactive and also learning for all of us in the system?
Yeah, I mean, that is the real trick to pull off, isn't it? So it's triangulation. So we need in both the kind of management system of the organisation that looks at people issues and clinical outcome issues. We need to make sure that there's proper triangulation across that set of information, so that we're not just looking at it in silos, and the same for the committees. Alison might want to come in, but Alison's refreshed the membership of all of the committees with new chairs, but also to make sure there's that crossover between the committees so that you can actually triangulate both on sort of data, but also in the conversation. So that's what we're doing.
Yeah, so in terms of that triangulation, we might have a chair of one committee who also sits as a non-exec on another committee. So, for instance, our chair on Quality Committee will be sitting on our Finance and Performance Committee, so that there is a crossover, and the same with the People Committee will also have the same crossover with the other two committees. So it's just so that there's a viewpoint that is focused in their own committee on their own subject, but then takes that to the other committees and brings that voice in. I think we saw it in action with the Finance and Performance yesterday.
Sarah Malik, GP partner member.
Thank you, Steve and Alison, for the presentation, which was very detailed and insightful. I'm just going to keep the focus on culture. And I have appreciated the dedication that you've applied to culture within your presentation, and as colleagues have discussed as well with you. I just wanted to touch upon the recent media case of the Nurses Tribunal. And my question to yourselves would be, could that have been stopped before it got to where it got to, using the new culture awareness and the creation of different ways of working? And the other part is, what have you learned to avoid any further public spend on such a situation with our workforce?
Yeah, thank you.
Another easy question.
Yeah. So, I mean, to answer your question directly, were there opportunities to do something different and to act sooner? Yes. Would that have stopped litigation? I don't know. But there were definitely opportunities to have taken a different course of action. And I think it's clear, and we've acknowledged publicly that we didn't sufficiently listen to the concerns that were being raised in a sufficiently open-minded way, and then consider what could have been done about it. So yes, we could have acted sooner, and we've offered an apology to all of the. I mean, everybody who's been impacted by this from all sorts of different angles has found it very difficult for obvious reasons. And then in terms of the point on spend, so just on, we'll confirm this at our board tomorrow, but I've reviewed the judgment, discussed it with colleagues. I've talked to Alison about it. So we're not intending to appeal the judgment. Our intention is to try and resolve the issues. And then going forward, neither of us were here when the case sort of was moving through. But probably both of us have worked in organisations that have quite a structured process to both before litigation, so assessing concerns and trying to deal with them. But then where litigation happens, because it happens in every organisation, making sure that there's good oversight and decision making on the balance of risk. And Alison and I want to make sure that that's put in place. That's not saying it wasn't in place, but it's always helpful to look back and go, what might you do differently in the future?
Ken Bremner, Foundation Trust partner member.
Question, I'll save Steve's voice for a second and ask a question to Alison. Just reflecting, Alison, on your new board composition, you've got a whole team of relatively new non-execs. I think it'd be interesting to hear from you about the skills they have in helping you to address some of the issues identified in the report, and in particular whether you've got anything built in there around clinical skills and expertise to act as that challenge to medical director, nurse director, but also support as well.
Thank you, Ken. I'll not mention names because some of them haven't quite finished their reference checks, etc. yet. So, but in terms of skills, so first of all, of the 5 that we've appointed, 4 are currently non-execs in our region, in other provider trusts. So they come with that. They're able to hit the ground running, for one thing, which from my perspective I absolutely need. But they come with that knowledge of how to be a non-executive director, how to be curious, how to challenge, but also how to support. So across their various experiences and skills, we have someone with a finance background who currently in their current provider trust chairs their finance committee and will be doing so in our organisation. We have someone who chairs a quality committee in a different provider and will be chairing our quality committee. We have someone who chairs a people committee in another provider and will be chairing our people committee. On the clinical side, one of those people, the chair of the quality committee, is from a clinical background. We have another non-exec with a clinical background. So we have a variety of skills and experience, but importantly come with that knowledge of what the job is and how to do it. And I think if I'd had 5 potentially great non-execs, but without the experience that these people have, and I had to then go through that learning process and getting them all up to speed, it would have been an impossible job for me, for one thing, but would have set us back a number of months. But our applicant list was fantastic. It was, as I say, the cream of the Northeast non-exec talent as far as I'm concerned, and I'm really grateful that they are the sort of people that rise to a challenge and walk towards a burning building rather than away from it. I'm really pleased with the team that we've got.
Neil O'Brien, Chief Medical Officer.
My question comes back to breast services. I think you already recognise the complexity of answering the question, how far do you look back? And I think there are many aspects to that question. Obviously, I co-chair the breast oversight group, and that is just debated in there. I guess my plea is that as an ICB, we will have the opportunity to feed into that and as a partner be a kind of an external scrutiny to answer that question. And I completely agree with the way the look back is being done on clinical priority and for individuals who have raised concerns through the helpline. They're the ones who should be going through first on clinical need. But answering that very difficult question of how far we go back, it's just to ensure and to reassure the board that we will be involved in that process.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, as you say, Neil, it is a challenging question to answer and come to the right conclusion. So the more pairs of eyes on it, the better. And I absolutely would expect us to agree anything with yourselves and NHS England colleagues.
Thank you. Sir Pally Hungin is Independent Non-Executive Director and Chair of our Quality and Safety Committee.
Thank you. Thank you very much for indicating the changes and the evolution of your governance and leadership roles. Good to hear that. My question is centered on clinicians. It's not unusual up and down the country within different providers to have difficulty in attracting high quality clinicians who are fully qualified. And sometimes the problem stretches back many, many years in terms of recruitment of appropriately qualified people, and also, as you've indicated, turnover of staff. So I'm not specifically picking on any individuals or your trust as such. One might argue that perhaps there has been a similar problem there for some time. What stratagems might you create to attract high quality, fully qualified consultants and other clinicians to your trust in a very competitive world, especially in the Northeast, where we have two very large teaching trusts? Have you thought about how you might go about this? It seems to me this might be something that's needed very urgently. Oh, and I do want to just sort of say, I feel that we are beholden to the very large number of people who have been working in the trust all these years, providing a service. Not everything has been perfect, but they have held things together, and I think that I'm very happy to pay tribute to them. So strategies for the future for very quickly getting people in that you can respect and like.
Yeah, thank you. Let me start with the second point first to just say I agree with your point entirely. It's important that we don't assume that every single thing that went wrong in breast applies to all of the other services, because that would not be correct. And we're very fortunate to have across senior medical staff and senior nursing staff a number of absolutely fantastic colleagues who really care about their work and their patients and each other. So in terms of the first question on how we attract people, so I mean, I always used to try and recruit the trainees that you could see coming through when you were managing or leading a service. And I think it's both about making sure that the work that they'll be engaged in the organisation speaks to their clinical interests and so on and so forth, but actually creating the environment so that they have a good experience, so that trainees want to come back, is one of the most important things to do. That is clear in some specialties, and in other specialties the opposite is clear as well. And I think where we struggle to recruit or can't recruit, particularly where there are trainees that go through the specialty, we have to ask ourselves why. And that applies to both undergraduate and postgraduate medical training. So again, I joined the medical student exams the other week, and some of the feedback from medical students and actually all colleagues in undergraduate training is often a really important smoke signal about where there might be challenges that need to be addressed. If people have a good learning experience, they're often quite interested in coming back. So that's the sort of generic one. I mean, it is also true to say that we are, in some cases, well able to recruit, and there's a job out at the moment, and I think there's like four or five applicants for one job. So it's important to be balanced about it, but creating the right environment, and where necessary, also making sure that you partner with other organisations, because sometimes it's helpful for people to be in bigger teams, but to work across organisations.
We've got about 5-7 minutes left, and I'll turn to our Chief Executive in a minute. I'll give you an opportunity to say any final things. I've got a couple of questions of my own, which are strategic questions, really. And maybe they're perhaps too long to debate at any length today. But I mean, the first is that, as you well know, and Alison particularly has been involved in some of the much stronger formal collaborative arrangements between Foundation Trusts in other parts of the region, in the Tees Valley and in the north of the patch. So far, Durham, under previous leadership, hadn't entered into any arrangements of that sort. Have you any plans to do that, and what would be the time scale you'd be working to?
So as you've said, Chair, I was very much involved in the Great North Healthcare Alliance. I'm a collaborator by nature, and I think that all of our NHS organisations ought to be collaborating with each other in any event. We are very keen, Steve and I, to be looking at collaboration across the Central Alliance. We've spoken to Ken and Ken's chair, Alison, in relation to that, and that's something that we are very keen to pursue, and I think that so are South Tyneside and Sunderland. And that's something that we will be pursuing in terms of the timescale on that. I think we absolutely need to be doing it in terms of some of our clinical pathways in any event, and I think that will drive us to a probably an earlier resolution of some of the discussions that we need to have, simply because I think it's very necessary for the people of our central patch that those discussions happen. But we haven't got an absolute time frame on it as yet. I think we're at early stages.
Okay, and then the second thing is, as you know, as part of the current reorganisation, foundation trusts are going to be taking on responsibility for neighbourhood health. Some would say you've got enough on your hands without having to get into that, but is there any way that that work could be complementary to the transformational work you're doing on the hospital services?
Yeah, absolutely, Liam. We have got a lot on, but we've also got strength in some of the services, and the community services in Durham and Darlington are strong in many respects. I've started to meet some colleagues from the different federations and so on, and we're really keen to work with them in a collaborative way, as Alison's said. One of the things that we absolutely want to try and do with the strategy work is to make sure it's grounded in population health and thinks about neighbourhoods. So absolutely.
Thank you. David Stout, our Senior Independent Non-Executive Director and Chair of our Audit Committee.
Thanks very much, Chair. Steve, I'm thinking about the directorates other than breast at the moment. How do you assure yourself and the board that the clinical standards being delivered in those specialties meet national clinical expectations? What's going to be your way forward on that?
So what we've done at the moment, David, is go back and look at all of the national clinical audits as our starting point, and to identify where there are either gaps or areas for improvement, and then to prioritise them, because every organisation will have something that is not quite as you would like in one of the audits. So it's making sure that we focus on the most material things in terms of risk to outcomes first, and then work our way through that. And we've got a similar process with GIRFT and the GIRFT reports. So to give you an example, whilst there's lots of stuff that's positive through the National Joint Registry, it's also flagged a couple of areas that we need to focus on. One is infection and one is choice of prosthesis. So that's our starting point for now.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you very much.
And before passing to Sam, just an extra point I want to make strategically, which doesn't concern you directly, or it may impinge on you, is that obviously this concern about breast cancer services has triggered thinking about the configuration of breast cancer services and breast cancer screening across the region as a whole. And when I was here as Chief Executive of the old Northern Regional Health Authority, breast cancer screening was just starting. And it became one of the most controversial parts of my work, in that there was, because of the prescribed arrangements, it meant moving services from one place to another and consolidating them. I know this similar discussion will now be taking place, but I think it's just very important to emphasise that it's important that the location of services is in the interests of patients, is done on a very strong evidence base. And one of the critical things is to ensure that the services have enough volume of work to develop the expertise required to get the best outcomes for women. So I know there's probably going to be another further wave of controversy over that, but I'd like to think it will land on the side of women rather than any other interests that might be in play. Sam Allen, Chief Executive.
Thank you, Steve and Alison. I just wanted to finish going back to the women who've been impacted by this, and I'm just really curious in terms of the contact that you've had with them. Has there been anything that you've heard from the women that perhaps didn't come up in the Albury report that's informed any of your work? Are there any strong themes there around their experience of the services?
Yeah, it's been a really interesting learning experience, Sam, and obviously very, very difficult in some circumstances. I think seeing it through their eyes has been really enlightening for us. It's individual little things that make quite a big difference to them. It might be how they're addressed, how they're even there was something about signage on a wall that was causing great distress to someone that we would never have picked up, but with the harm that had been caused to that person, it meant a lot to them to have to walk past a particular sign on the way in for treatment. It's just little things that you need to very much listen to and act on. I would hope that of the meetings we've had so far, it's been helpful to the women. I think some don't want to engage, and that's absolutely fine. But for those that have the courage to come and see us, and I think it is a courageous thing to do, then I think they've gained from the experience, and I think they've felt listened to. I hope they've felt listened to.
Thank you. Alison, Steve, I don't know whether any final comments you wanted to make before I conclude.
Just wanted to repeat the fact that, thank you for the welcome and for giving us the opportunity today. I think there's a lot of learning from what County Durham and Darlington have been through and are still going through. I've tried to be as open as I can with my fellow chairs across provider trusts to try and share some of that learning. But if there are any NHS organisations that feel they could benefit from more of a one-to-one conversation, then we'd be very happy to do that and to facilitate that. I don't think there'll be any organisation in the region that couldn't learn something.
Thank you. Well, I'd just like to thank you on behalf of the board that this has been a very, very valuable discussion. We've learned things from you during the discussion, but particularly would like to thank you for your stewardship of this important trust during a very, very difficult time, and the spirit of openness. There are no secrets, and also the many, many examples of the compassion you're showing for patients and for staff in the way that you're handling these changes. So thank you and safe journey back, and we look forward to continuing to work with you. So we'll now return to the order of the agenda, and we're on to item 9, which is the Board Assurance Framework for Q3 2025-6, and Claire Riley, our Chief Corporate Services Officer, is going to talk about this.
Thank you, Chair. The board will be familiar with this report. This is a report that you receive on a regular basis. Note that this report in its format is currently being reviewed in light of the ICB blueprint, so therefore over the coming months will likely evolve to align to our duties as set out in that document. We're also reviewing the scoring of risk to ensure that there is consistency across teams and departments. From a risk movement point of view, the report highlights some reduced risks for all age continuing care, care education and treatment reviews, right to choose and running costs, and there is a descriptor within the report as to why they have reduced. There is an increased risk which is on capital spend, and again there is a descriptor in the report for that. There are some new corporate risks that have been added, which include the delegation from NHS to ICB on the practice level support operating and commissioning model, COVID vaccinations for 2026-27. There is an issue, or was an issue, with BadgerNet, which is the maternity records last year, and also changes to out-of-hours services in the north of the patch. Other than that, Chair, I hope the board will approve that this document as that it reflects the risks of the organisation, and note that the risk register is also attached to the document.
Thank you. Christopher Ackers-Belcher, the Health Watch representative on the board.
Thank you, Chair. It was just around the new corporate risk and around COVID, and I don't think it really helps the cause when we have this messaging that the risk of COVID around population health still exists, and then NHSE has confirmed a 50% reduction in the COVID programme funding, and it's just what more can we do from a comms point of view in order to prepare ourselves for that for 26-27.
Claire, Sam, would you like to comment?
I think Neil probably would like to come in, but I think particularly around our targeted vaccination campaign and also making sure that we've got good, accessible and correct information out in the public domain. But I know Neil will add to that.
So yes, we have our vaccination oversight group, which links into all of our local place-based vaccination oversight groups, and we're managing this, the change in approach. One of the big risks is at the minute that we're trying to actively manage is to get community pharmacies and general practices to sign up to delivering the vaccination programme, both the upcoming one in the spring booster and then the following autumn. There have been some national contractual changes that are making that difficult. We're looking at alternative arrangements that could mitigate any of the risk to ensure that we've got good population coverage. But we're just working through it now. There's still a deadline for a couple of weeks for community pharmacists and practices to sign up. Once that's known, we can bring further updates to the board.
And just to add to that, Christopher, we really welcome any feedback. So if you think there's anything further that we need to add into the mix, please do let us know.
Thank you. David Chandler, Chief Finance.
Yeah, just to add for the board, around the capital risk, the infrastructure board met on Friday, where we also reviewed the capital plan and forecast for the year. NHS England have been able to make more capital resources available to provider trusts, which are going through a process now with our support. So the capital risk is reduced from the time of writing.
As there are no further clarifications or questions, would you approve the report? So the report's approved. Thank you. Moving now to the reports of the subcommittees of the board, or committees of the board. All of the minutes are in the public domain, so these reports are just to highlight any matters that might require comment or discussion. Sam Allen, Chief Executive with the Executive Committee, highlight.
Thank you very much, Chair. So the highlight report covers 3 meetings: the November meeting, the December meeting and the January meeting. Just in terms of the business, you'll see that we undertook a whole raft of policy work, and particularly wanted to highlight 2 policies: the sexual misconduct policy and the freedom to speak up policy that we approved for the organisation. And we also received a detailed update from our all-age continuing healthcare task force steering group, which our chief nurse Hilary Lloyd leads, and that particularly highlighted progress in 4 main areas of work that that task force is progressing at the moment, as well as the risks and issues, as well as our plans to address them. I'm really happy to take any questions on the report, Chair.
Are there any questions? No, thank you very much indeed. Moving on to the Quality and Safety Committee, Sir Pelly Hungin.
Thank you very much. The report from the meeting is included in the papers for today. I'd like to highlight 3 items, perhaps in reverse order, if you don't mind. Just to indicate that the procedures for the Safeguarding Children, Adults and Care for Care Children, the procedures are changing as the ICB evolves. And since we are concerned with quality and safety, I wanted to highlight the fact that there are certain increased risks, particularly in terms of recruitment of clinicians, and also in terms of rationalizing the way the service is going to be delivered. We're quite satisfied that and assured that the correct procedures and appropriate governance is being followed, but I thought that you might want to know that. Secondly, as we evolve, and I continue to use that word evolve, I'm very much aware on our committee, the Quality and Safety Committee, that we're likely to be undergoing a shift in the way we function, and our remit may change. That the involvement and engagement group has become extremely important in terms of providing feedback. The patient voice has been increasingly important for us, for hearing and listening to people's concerns about all the good things that are happening and things that could be done better. And as the chair of the committee, I would like to emphasize the importance of having that voice continuing and possibly even reinforced in the future as part of our commissioning role. We need to hear what our public is saying. I think you referred to that earlier yourself. And thirdly, closing referral black holes. This came to our attention initially through a report in the Guardian newspaper, which indicated that a fresh report which had been done by Health Watch England indicated that up to 1 in 7 of referrals to the hospital sector were going astray. And this struck a chord with us. This is not an unusual experience of miscommunication or missed letters either from primary into secondary care, or a lack of continuity in terms of the provision of appointments from the secondary care viewpoint, and patients getting lost in the system and having to phone up to see what was happening. So this was an important area, and we were fortunate enough to have our patient group through our local health watch to supply us with a report about the situation in the north of England. We do not have any specific data as relating to our ICB locality, but it's clearly a matter of some concern that patients are being missed. And if we are following the national trend, then 1 in 7 is quite a high number and something to worry about. Our plan is to try to dig deeper into existing local data and also to maintain contact with our providers to ensure that things are not going badly wrong.
Thank you.
That's all I need to say.
Are there any comments or questions? Christopher.
You'd be surprised to know, about the black hole with regards to the referrals, and I do think, it is a national report, so you've got to take it as a national report, but we haven't received anything locally feedback from hospital trusts with regards to an acceptance or a denial about whether referrals are being lost. But I do think it's something that our involvement teams, whether that's Health Watch or internal with the ICB, could have a look at. But it does go much wider, because some of the concerns is not so much when the referral is sent, it's what happens to the patient before the referral is sent, when they're going for x-rays, they're going for MRI scans, they're referred to pain management. So actually just looking at statistics around waiting times from a referral, that's only one part of the story around population health, and it's also impacted more lately because the waiting well now is about work well. So there's a cohort of people who don't have that access as well. But I definitely think we should build it into a future work programme that perhaps we can collaborate on, or it can be done internally, but I'm more than happy to assist.
Thank you. I mean, just a little point on it. The area which has always been a concern in patient safety, not just this country, but other countries as well, has been the communication of the outcome of a consultation in the hospital, particularly test results. And this has been described as not assuming that no news is good news. And there have been many examples around the world of patients not receiving their cancer diagnosis when in fact they do have a cancer diagnosis. So there's a spectrum of difficulties for dangers with this. It's not purely administrative efficiency. It can be more serious than that. So thank you. I'd just like to, on the safeguarding matter, a point that I think we just ought to flag up, and I'll ask for the Chief Executive's comments. We've been talking internally about the situation whereby our responsibilities and accountabilities are governed by the Health and Care Act 2022. And yet we've started a reorganisation where both the direction of travel for our new responsibilities would end up in different legislation, but isn't there yet. But in the meantime, we've been required to reduce our staff levels and functions to meet the expected legislation. So does that leave us at any risk in any areas where we're not any longer staffed or where there's ambiguous accountability?
Thank you, Salim. And so we do still remain a statutory board, and in terms of the legislation, it's the 22 Act that sets out our statutory requirements. I am confident, and I have sought through the process, and we'll go back around this once more, of the change we're going through in terms of my chief officers, that we are and we still will be able to meet our statutory requirements, and that does also include safeguarding. I think there will be elements of how we approach things whereby we will be working within a reduced workforce, particularly in relation to some of the relationships that our partners have that have endured over many years and have supported, and obviously we'll go through change. But when it comes to our statutory duties, which do remain until such time as the legislation changes, I am confident that we will have the capacity in order to meet them.
Thank you. Mike Smith.
So it's just to touch on the referral black holes issue, but I'll just go back a step to the comments about test results and communication of results. Many of the board members will recall previous meetings where we've discussed issues where things have not been communicated out from hospitals, often discharge letters or other communications. So to report on some positive work in that domain, certainly Northumbria hospitals have developed bespoke software to make sure that there's an end-to-end tracker so we can identify when that doesn't happen. So raising these things at board has been helpful in the past in that regard. And on a primary care end, we're now at a stage of almost all patients essentially having access to their NHS app if they choose to do so, where they'll be able to see their own test results as soon as they've been filed on the practice end, which helps put an extra safety net in place to make sure results can be seen by the patient. And I know my patients use that a lot. Regarding the referral black holes, which is more of an issue of patients getting into the system rather than the data coming back out of the system after they've had a test or a consultation, I think this is definitely a problem in our region. As a practicing GP, the system is Byzantine complexity. There's so many different pathways patients end up on. If you go into even for the same specialty between different hospitals, they have different waiting list approaches. It's a very complex area, and inevitably patients will fall through the gaps in this. So I think focus and work within our region would be helpful to try and identify where the problems are and how we can make it better.
Thank you. Mike, you're also reporting on the Finance, Performance and Investment Committee.
Yes, it's a relatively brief report. The information in the board papers details previous meetings we've had at the back end of 2025. In 2026, we've had several shorter meetings to cover off the medium-term financial plan, which we'll be covering in more detail later in the agenda, so I won't go into that.
Thank you. And the Audit Committee, David, I understand that there's nothing this time and waiting for the next meeting.
We're up to date, Chairman.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. We are now due to have our short lunch break. So we'll be back in our seats at what time? 12:40. Thank you very much. This is the board meeting of the Integrated Care Board for North East and North Cumbria, 27th of January 2026, resuming after a short lunch break and returning to the agenda, which brings us to item 12, which is the North East and North Cumbria ICB medium-term planning 2026-27 to 2030-31 submission. And Jacqueline Myers, our Chief Strategy Officer, and David Chandler, our Chief Finance Officer, are going to present this item.
Thank you, Chair. There's quite a lot to get through, and would propose that I'll start and just bring us up to date in terms of the process we've been going through and where we've got to in the various elements of the planning round. And also I'll give a quick overview of the performance standard position in the draft submission that went in just before Christmas. David will then take us through the financial position, and as Michelle's with us, we'll defer to Michelle just to give a bit of a more detailed picture in terms of the provider workforce submission. So that's what we propose to do, and we have some slides to support this process. So we have had a couple of discussions about this most recent planning round at the board already, just to remind colleagues. We received initial planning guidance back in September and began doing some preparatory work. And then in November, we received the detailed planning requirements, including the financial allocations. We brought our ICB commissioning intentions to the board in November, and they were approved. And we've been working internally in the ICB and with system partners to develop a set of plans. There are some notable changes to the way that the planning round is being organised this year, which reflect the evolving role of the ICB relative to NHS England as the regulator. Notably, we're not required this year to make a full combined system submission, but rather there is an ICB submission, and then separately there are direct submissions by our 11 provider trusts to NHS England, albeit we need to work closely together to ensure a close alignment between our plans as commissioners and theirs as providers. I mentioned already, but there was a first set of draft submissions by both the ICB and by provider trusts on the 17th of December. That was quite a short time frame from when the financial allocations landed and were played out, only about 2.5 weeks. And so inevitably, whilst a lot of work went into those submissions, it was expected and indeed acknowledged by our Chief Executive of the NHS in England that a lot of work was going to have to take place between then and when the final and full submissions take place on the 12th of February in just a few weeks' time. I'll go into a bit more detail about what those submissions require in a moment, but just to say, to support that further process, our regional team has run a set of review meetings with each and every one of our trusts, which our Chief Exec and Chair were party to. In addition, and in collaboration with our regional colleagues, we've been doing a number of deeper dive meetings with trusts of concern. So 4 trusts we identified who were had particular challenges in terms of submitting a plan that met all of the requirements set out in the operational planning guidance. We've also internally in the ICB been doing a number of preparation challenge and plan development meetings to meet the efficiency requirements we've set ourselves against our ICB budgets, and also to work through how we might meet our commissioning intentions. And at the moment we're in a phase of everybody providing weekly updates to try and give an indication of where they're going to land in relation to the plan. But a particular challenge for us is that both the providers and the ICB have the same final submission deadline of the 12th of February. And because of the timelines I've already described, there's going to be, I think, a lot of work right up to hard on the deadline. So there will be lots of work done to try and ensure that we have alignment and that we meet the requirements of us by commissioners. For example, to commission sufficient activity for the providers to meet the planning guidance. But that's a challenge for us given the way that we are all working to a very tight deadline. Just moving on in terms of the slides. And just to set out the timeline and content, some of this is past now, and I know it's quite hard to see on the screen, but you have the slides before you. Just wanted in this slide to draw out in the middle of the table there the array of things that are needing to be completed and submitted for the 12th February deadline. So 3-year finance plans, 4-year capital plans, and I know David will say a bit more about that. For the providers, 3-year workforce plans, 3-year activity and performance plans, as well as an integrated medium-term plan and a board assurance statement. And then for the ICB, a 5-year strategic plan, and similarly for the providers, a 5-year strategic plan, and then for the ambulance service, a 3-year operational plan. So the intention of this year's planning round is that the 12th of February will be a full and final submission, but obviously depending on whether or not all organisations are able to meet all the requirements asked, it's possible by exception there may be some further iterations of elements of plans. Obviously we hope not, and that we're able to land a full set of plans in February, but we'll be talking through some of the challenges we're facing in that regard as we go into the detail. In terms of our own board assurance and timeline, this just gives you a sense of the key points along the journey. I think it was mentioned by Mike, our chair of our Finance Performance Investment Committee, that we've been doing a number of extraordinary meetings with that committee's oversight of the planning process. One took place on the 15th of January, and indeed following that it was decided that a couple more specific focus meetings would occur, one on the deconstruction of the block contracts and one on workforce, and one of those has occurred and one's due to occur, so we're working through those at the moment. You can see here we've got the board discussion today. There is an opportunity for a further Finance and Performance Committee discussion, and then an Executive Committee discussion before we bring the plan to board for approval on the 12th of February, which is hard on the national submission deadline. I know that's been related to making sure we've got a full and core at board on the 12th. Just moving on then to talk about what we saw in the initial submission in regard to the performance requirements. I think it's fair to say that in summary there's quite a lot of distance to travel if we're to get to meet the asks in the planning round for the next 2 years, but part of that is because significantly ambitious targets and standards have been set for the plan. Just to give you a summary, and I think we've provided a detailed appendix with all of the draft submissions, and recognising again that these plans were developed in a point in time. We had pretty strong compliance with the mental health, learning disability and autism metrics, with the only metric that hasn't yet got a compliant plan is the one around the numbers of individual placement support plans that we're able to put in place. In terms of the urgent and emergency care standards, they were met at aggregate level across North East and North Cumbria, but in the individual providers there were some of the standards that some providers were not able to give a plan to meet in the draft submission. In terms of primary community care, again, strong performance, one exception, and that's around over 52-week waits for children and young people, and the year-on-year reductions required there. We've previously had a deep dive into 52-week waits, and we know that there are a number of challenges there, but further work to do to try and reduce those waiting times for children and young people. So in performance terms, the area of the plan that was really deeply challenged in terms of the draft submission relates to the elective, diagnostic and cancer standards. These are the standards that are most closely related, not solely but closely related to the levels of activity that trusts can afford to do, and the ask is extremely ambitious. It's for a 7% improvement in terms of the headline elective 18-week standard from referral to treatment, and that's 7% on top of whatever trusts plan to do this year. So we have a number of trusts who are behind plan in year, and so the combined impact of that is that potentially they may have as much as a 10% improvement to make based on where they're currently forecasting they will land by the end of the year. There are similarly challenging asks around improvements in reducing over 6-week waits for diagnostics, hitting the 80% fast diagnosis standard, and indeed driving further improvement in the cancer 62-day standard. I know that our providers are working very hard to try and improve their plans from their draft to final submission, and we're starting now to get some information feeding through around where they're getting to. So we're hopeful to see significant improvement across these standards, but it remains an area of risk for us as an ICB in terms of our aggregate achievement of those standards. Just to say briefly before I hand over to David what we're doing in regard to address that challenge and support our providers in developing plans that will meet the national ask. I mentioned already the provider of concern reviews, and we agreed a number of helpful actions out of those meetings. As part of our ongoing arrangements, we continue to support trusts who are challenged in terms of their operational performance through a local so-called Tier 3 arrangement, where if trusts don't meet a kind of level of performance that merits national or regional intervention, we intervene locally to work together supportively to try and improve performance. Also, there have been a number of so-called Q4 sprints announced. These are initiatives by NHS England, which are backed by some non-recurrent additional funds to help try and address some of the underperformance in this year's plan. And on the slide there it lists the 4 different sprints, some of which have had multiple phases that have been announced so far. So money to support improved in-year performance against the cancer, faster diagnosis and 62-day performance. Excuse me. A sprint that's focused specifically on increasing the number of clock stops, pathways that are concluded following an outpatient appointment. For a third sprint that's focused on treating more of those patients who are waiting over 52 weeks. And then a fourth sprint that's focused on supporting long waiter treatments for people who are on independent sector provider waiting lists. So all of this positive, and a number of our providers have had access to this. Obviously some challenges around operationalising it in such a tight timescale, but we do hope and expect that the providers who've had the benefit of qualifying for some of these additional sprint monies will be able to play the impact of that into their plan in a positive way, and therefore provide an improved plan for their final submission. So that chairs my quick summary of where we are in terms of the initial planning phase and the next steps that we'll be taking through to the 12th, and I'll hand over to David now to talk us through the financial position.
Thank you. David, just before you come in, there is a question from the public relating to this medium-term planning submission. So part of it is financial and part of it is to do with openness of the process. So if I could let you do your part of the presentation, and then I'll read that into the record, and then you can respond before we start our discussion.
I'm so sorry, Chair. Can I just say I failed to do my last slide, which was about the board assurance framework. So may I just take the mic back briefly? Yes. I'm so sorry. The board will be aware that this year there's a new element to the planning submission, and that's a board assurance framework. It was issued fairly late, even after the allocations, and so we didn't have the opportunity to review the draft as a board, although we did share it informally. But I've included it in the pack of papers today. As our Chief Exec mentioned in her briefing, there's now been a further version of that board assurance framework. I think it has actually been issued last night, Sam. I haven't actually seen it myself, but I understand there are a number of changes to it. That being said, we are working up a further final draft of that board assurance framework, and we'll ensure that we engage with the board on that, as Sam mentioned earlier, before we bring it as part of the package of things for approval on the 12th. But in the pack, you have the summary in the slide pack, and indeed the full summary in the papers of where we got to in terms of the draft. Suffice to say that we've made a number of further developments and improvements, and we expect to show an improved position in terms of compliance with the board assurance statements when we bring that to the board later next month. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay, David. So if you carry on with your part of the presentation, and then I'll read out the question and we'll answer that and move into the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I intend to attempt to answer the question as part of the presentation anyway, so it should be fairly obvious when I get to that point.
I better read it in the record then, so people know whether we've answered it adequately. I'll do that now.
If you want.
Yeah. Okay. So it's quite a lengthy question. It comes from a group called Keep Our NHS Public North East. Keep Our NHS Public North East. At the ICB meeting on 25th of November, CEO Sam Allen publicly stated that over 50% of the ICB budget is already spent outside the NHS. And then there are 2 points, subsidiary points there, questions. Does this figure of greater than 50% include payments for general and personal medical services, dental services, continuing healthcare and prescribing costs? And then what is the breakdown of the over 50% of the ICB budget spent outside the NHS? Please provide the list of services and contractors that the ICB contracts with, excluding general and personal medical services, dental services, care and nursing homes. And then we have also noted that within item 12, NEC ICB medium-term planning update, which is what we're considering now, the actual plans are not being presented at a public board meeting, but at an extraordinary ICB meeting on 12th of February. With regard to transparency and collaboration, when will users of the health services in the North East and North Cumbria have an opportunity to view and comment on the update to the ICB medium-term plans? So if you would, David, as you make your presentation, give answers to those 2 finance questions, and then Jacqueline and Sam can talk us through the transparency point.
Will do, Chair. So in terms of the finance for submission, I've got about 10 slides to go through. I'll hopefully go through those relatively briefly, but hopefully enough detail that people and members of the board are able to be adequately updated. Before I make a start, I just thought I'd share 3 quick points. So the first point is the uplift for ICB growth over the next 3 years is on average 2.7%. I just want to make the point to the board and to members of the board and others watching that NHS price inflation is generally around 2 to 3% every year. It can vary, but it's in that order. And every year, we have an ageing population, so activity growth for services will grow by 1 to 2%. And we also have increasing expectations from NHS England in terms of improving or reducing waiting times and the like. When you add up all these things together, they quickly get to pressures on the NHS England of the ICB budget of 5 to 7% each year. So just to have that at the back of your minds, because really the only way to manage the gap between an uplift in funding and the increased pressures on the budget is to either be more efficient and do more with less, or to actually look at what we actually provide and consider providing less services in certain areas. The second point is to note that we have effectively a bit of a change in approach from NHS England of late. And we are moving to a number of changes. So, for example, NHS England are keen that there is a much fairer share of funding to systems. And whilst we have a formula that does that, there are still areas where maybe that don't apply fair share funding, and a good example of that is deficit support funding. So you will see in the presentation that deficit support funding, so funding to trusts that are unable to have a break-even plan, is being withdrawn gradually, and allocations for things like elective recovery is being allocated on a fair share basis. We're also moving to a more rules-based approach. Some examples of that are where organisations are very much expected to produce a break-even plan and deliver it, but also moving, especially in acute services, back to a more payment by results type of arrangement. So basically, organisations being paid per unit of activity rather than under block contracts. Well, we have a bit of a mix at this moment in time. The planning guidance came out on the 17th of November, if I've got the exact date to mind, and you'll see in the presentation, submissions for the first plan were on the 17th of December. So that didn't give an awful lot of time for organisations to develop plans, and even final submissions, which are due on the 12th of February, again, doesn't give a lot of time. So this year for 26-27 undoubtedly feels like a bit of a transition year as we move from one way of working as an ICB, becoming more of a commissioner, to future years. So this year will very much feel like a transition year, and that hopefully will come over in the finance slides. So getting into the slides in detail, you can see there on the screen that allocations have now been issued for 3 years. So that allows systems and organisations to plan for the medium term rather than 1 year at a time. The allocation growth, as I mentioned, 2.7%. And the amount allocated for price inflation has been netted off that for an efficiency requirement of 2%. So in essence, flat cash for price growth inflation. The remaining, effectively 2.67%, is allocated for expectations in improvements in activity and the like in acute community mental health and other contracts. And nationally, the amounts required to be uplifted to various contracts was calculated to achieve performance targets such as improving waiting times by 7%. So those figures were shared with both commissioners and providers, helpfully I feel, at the start of the planning process. Other quick things to mention in terms of allocations, elective recovery funding. I mentioned before about fair shares of funding, so we've now received our fair share of elective recovery funding. It was very easy to argue last year that we didn't get that, or at least in 25-26, so that's been corrected for. And I mentioned the deficit for support funding being removed. It's getting removed at 2% of income per annum for those organisations that receive it. And I'll show you later some of the actual figures that relates to. It's quite a significant sum. That is probably the biggest impact and change to a number of our FT providers in terms of impact on their ability to deliver a financial plan for next year. The second big change is around contract rebasing. And I will touch on this in more detail in a slide, but just to share that there is an expectation that ICBs work with Foundation Trust to change how they are funded and looking at the actual amount they would receive under PBR, under payment by results, on an activity basis rather than under what they have at the moment, which is effectively a block contract arrangement with some elements of PBR within it. There is a maximum which you can shift at 2.5% per annum, and I'll touch on that in a moment. If I move to the next slide, we are, in terms of the month or so that we had to pull together a draft plan, we did agree across partners, across the ICS, that we would use a principles-based approach. We updated principles that we already had in place. I've listed a few of those there for you so you can see the sort of principles that we work to. But for example, very much making sure that patients at the heart of the financial plan, living within means, the benefits of system working, being kept, but ultimately trying to keep things as simple and pragmatic as possible for 26/7 especially. From an ICB perspective, because not only is an ICS plan goes in, an ICB plan goes in, making sure that when we do our financial strategy, where we're aligning things like commissioning intentions, we align those to efficiency requirements as well, so we don't do things in isolation. Recognising that growth assumptions are inherent in our contracts, and that we would apply those per NHS England guidance, and also making sure that we look to invest on the left shift, which is moving effectively from acute to community, from treatment to prevention, and from analogue to digital, and trying to protect some resources in that space in recognition of the 10-year plan, which is a 10-year plan, and this obviously I refer a lot to the first year of that. On elective recovery funds, which is about reducing the time people wait for treatment in hospitals especially, we did receive an extra £44 million of fair shares funding, which is not an insignificant amount, and we've allocated that to all our providers on a fair share basis. In terms of the initial submission, which was sent in on the 17th of December, so a month after the guidance came out, The majority of our organisations were able to submit a compliant break-even plan. However, 4 were unable to do that. And that is a combination of because of the scale of the financial challenge that they face, but also in terms of other changes that they might be going through at this moment in time. We heard today from County Durham Down Foundation Trust, where they obviously had a lot of changes to their board structure of late, but also organisations where they're reliant on contract offers from other commissioners. And Newcastle Hospitals is a good example of that. They've probably got the most complex financial plan to develop. The 3 trusts that were in deficit in 25-26, I mentioned that they will be receiving less deficit support funding, being reduced at 2% per annum. And I've included there the 3 organisations and the figures that are attached to those organisations. They are not insignificant sums, and basically those organisations will have to identify additional cost improvements if they are to balance their plan by those figures, compared to an organisation that doesn't receive deficit support funding. So in essence, what that means is virtually every provider organisation across the ICS will have a cost improvement plan of between 5 and 7%. That is not an insignificant sum, and that's following the previous year for 25-26 of similar sums and the year before. So those are causing all sorts of pressures and stress on our provider sectors. This slide here just provides you a summary of the submission. I'm not listing every organisation, Chair, but you can see that the organisations that weren't able to submit a compliant plan, that second column there, that totalled £120 million. So each organisation that weren't able to deliver or submit a compliant plan, in the region of around £30 million each or so, that was the scale of the challenge that they still have outstanding at this moment in time. If I can move on now, though, to the ICB financial plan rather than the system one, this slide here shows you the amount of money that the ICB has at its disposal. I've broken it down between the various elements, so core funding of approximately £7.5 billion. I've also listed all the other elements of income or allocation that comes to the ICB. In terms of the question that we had from earlier, this slide probably helps answer that one in the main, but to add to that, approximately, when you take everything into account, included our delegated specialist commissioning responsibilities now, approximately 60% of our allocation goes to NHS providers and 40% to non-NHS providers now. And of that 40%, 3/4 of that would go to primary care providers, whether that be a dental service or a GP provider or ophthalmology, and prescribing, so on drugs, and also on packages of care. The remaining 10% would go to independent sector or voluntary sector type organisations and the like. Okay, that hopefully just gives you an overview of where the effectively £10 billion goes to in a relatively simple form. We do, as an ICB, publish information about all expenditure over £25,000 on our website. So if you require more detail than that, that is where you would find that type of information. But I thought it just gives you a bit of context anyway about the allocation that the ICB will receive over the next 3 years, growing at around 2.7%. In terms of source and application of funds, I've focused on the 26-27 plan in the main because that's the one that NHS England will be most interested in. And what you can see there is that we start off with, in our plan, an underlying deficit of £4.4 million in the ICB against that 10 billion. We've got programme growth funding, so that's how much funding we've got coming in for the ICB for core funding increasing coming in for GPs and dental and the like, that extra elective recovery funding coming in, and you can see how that's all being played out. That still leaves us, though, with a challenge, and that challenge is around some of our unfunded pressures. So we have seen significant growth in the independent sector, in packages of care, in drugs, in ADHD assessment and treatment, and also we are now expected to continue to make payments to providers where we have supported them with deficit support. So whilst the national deficit support funding is being reduced, we are expected to continue to support organisations where we've been supporting them non-recurrently. There's an expectation we do that for a number of years, albeit that would reduce over time. What that means is when we recognise all those pressures, that what you will see is that we need to generate an efficiency programme, and we've got a programme of £121 million, which I'll touch on in a moment. We can release reserves of around £18 million, and that still leaves us a gap of £20 million, but on a £10 billion budget, that is a relatively manageable sum of resource that we need to manage between now and the end of the year. That creates us a balanced plan for 26-27. I would just want to make sure that I sort of share this slide with you, because this slide basically shows you how the core ICB growth will be applied to contracts. And what you can see there, the percentages by area, whether that's elective, A&E or maternity, they are the national formula calculations that were shared with us. So these are the sum that NHS England believe needs to go to various sectors to deliver the performance standards expected from each sector. And against that, I show how the £193 million is allocated across NHS and non-NHS providers. One point I would bring out here is most of the uplifts are around 2%. The one that's highest is community left shift funding. We have basically an extra 4.2% for left shift, and that 4.2% grows every year. So it grows next year and it grows the year after, and that's the sum that we'll be looking to allocate to apply some of that left shift that I've been talking about over the next 10 years. This year it may have to go on pressures rather than investments, but that should only be a temporary measure. The ICB efficiency requirement, I talked about £121 million. I've laid out the 3-year plan for you there, but in essence what you'll see is we're looking to make efficiencies on packages of care, which is the first line, prescribing costs and of 3% each. We do service reform every single year, and that's looking at what we're actually commissioning and can we do less of or do things more efficiently at £30 million a year, and some estate changes. The other point to note there is the £19 per head reductions. That's the running cost reductions that we've been talking about today as well. That is an actual cash reduction that comes in 26-27. So we'll be able to employ less staff in the organisation. And then we have some non-recurrent efficiency programme savings, which we have every single year, and they are of a similar nature and a similar scale of previous years. Nearly there, Chair. Last couple of slides. This one is just basically an overview of the key submission that goes into NHS England. It's there to show you that the plan from financial basis for the ICB is compliant and summarises those numbers that I've talked about. I'm just expected to share that with the board, so I'll put that on screen. The last probably main challenging area for the ICB to work through between now and final submission, Chair, is the acute block deconstruction work. And this is all part of that expectation from NHS England to move to fairer share funding and for providers to be funded on a fairer basis and move away from block contracts. It is primarily focused on the acute side. Community and mental health will follow in due course. And as you can see there, as I put in the slide, the block deconstruction work was actually a piece of work that was done in September 2025. There was no expectation at that point in time that this data would be actually used to inform allocations for providers. Okay, the reason I mention that is because the data validation that was done by the ICB was effectively minimal, and every provider looked at that in a slightly different way from a different viewpoint, and that gives us issues around the quality of the data. So to rely on this information to make significant financial changes is challenging and something we're working through as a system. We are expected though to make progress in this area, up to a maximum of 2.5% of NHS income per year on acute contracts, subject to affordability, and that is something we also have to take account of as an ICB. We've been working this through with chairs, with chief execs, director of finances, a working group, and the finance committee, and we expect to have a paper on this that will be shared with director of finances and chief execs in the coming day and ahead of the 12th of February submission. I talked about some of the significant issues. I just thought I'd share with you some of the scale of this, but the national exercise that was submitted suggested that the ICB is paying £19 million too much for acute services. I would say, though, that should be taken very much with a pinch of salt. Now, I'll give you one really good example. In one of our provider organisations, they have approximately £30 million of uncoded data. So we have to take account of that. I think we're going to allocate resources in a fair and equitable way. A number of organisations also apply very different business rules when they calculate these sums. And we have said it's important that we do look at these things in a fair, open and transparent way, rather than just relying on data that's only come from a provider not being validated. If we were to apply the rules on day one up to 2.5%, we would be applying approximately £30 million to two underfunded trusts, and we will be reducing £30 million from funding from 3 underfunded trusts in the main. One of those we've heard about today, which we know has got significant financial challenges. Another is aligned to an organisation in South Tees, which again has different financial challenges and is losing deficit support funding. And the other one is Sun and South Tyneside Foundation Trust. Reducing income by 2% or 2.5% in one fell swoop is very challenging, where you only hear about it in November. So we are looking to sort of say, can we do this? And not only is it affordable for the ICB, but it's affordable and manageable for those organisations as well as ensuring the data is solid and reliable, and everybody can trust that this is coming to the right conclusion. So that piece of work, Chair, that's probably the most important work we need to finish before the 12th of February submissions, and there's a plan to do that. In terms of capital, there's some capital allocations there. The main thing to note on capital is, rather than getting a system allocation for capital, Chair, in the future, from 26-27, allocations will go direct to organisations in the main. The good news on capital is that there are significant sums available for strategic change aligned to the 10-year plan. And I've listed some of the sums there on the slide for you. They are regional allocations, and we will be expected as organisations and as a system to apply and bid for funds within those envelopes. But they are significant, large amounts that should help organisations improve things such as constitutional standards or estate safety. And that's all from me, Chair, on the finance side.
Thank you. So just moving on to the workforce headlines. So as my colleagues have said, this is the first submission that we've got. So it is a moving feast in terms of subsequent the final submission that will go in. So overall, we've got trusts forecasting 2.9% more staff in post than they originally planned through the last planning round. So by March 26 this year, they have predicted 2.9% more staff than what they had originally planned on. Looking forward across the trusts, we are looking at a 2% reduction of our workforce, and that's our total workforce by March 27, with the exception of CDTFT and NEAS, who at this point in time when they submitted the plan were looking at growth. Further reductions of 1.5% across the trusts by March 2028. So when we look at that in terms of what it means from a substantive perspective, trusts are forecasting an increase of substantive staff than their original plan of 1.6%. But for the following year, we are looking at planning a reduction of 1.5% again, with the exception of those two individual trusts, and then a further reduction in 2028 of 1.2%. So moving on to our temporary workforce, so bank staff, so trusts are forecasting an increase, a significant increase you'll see there in bank staff of 51.6% from their original March 26 plan. So what a number of trusts have done is looked at reducing their agency usage, and that has resulted in moving that into more bank staff, and that is a cheaper method. We're looking at a planned reduction of bank staff of 12.2% by March 27, and then a further reduction of 9.3% by March 28. And then in agency, again, the trusts were forecasting 12.4% more use of agency staff than what they originally planned. But there is a planned reduction of 34.4% by March 27, and then a further reduction by March 2028. As I've said, this is an indicative plan that was put in originally, So what we've done is worked with our colleagues across with NHS England, regional colleagues, and we've developed key lines of inquiry that we have gone back to the trusts and begun to work with the trusts around understanding what are some of the challenges and just really understanding the information behind the data to help inform the final plan that goes in. So you'll see here we've put questions in around the reductions in workforce, thinking about that triangulation piece. Our colleagues have mentioned performance, have mentioned finance, have mentioned quality. So it's how does a reduction in workforce impact upon all of those things, and how are we ensuring that triangulation is there? Bank and agency reductions, you'll see there that, again, we've just asked for board assurances that the actions required for the deliverability of those. And again, thinking about that triangulation, what are the quality and the safety implications if we achieve those big reductions? Sickness is another one that, again, the trusts have been challenged around. There's an ambitious sickness target in there, which is how do we support the well-being of our colleagues across the system, knowing that as a North East region, we have got high levels of sickness. So again, just seeking assurances of what additional actions are we doing to support the health and well-being of our staff. We've talked earlier about vaccinations. We know that 50% of our colleagues have received vaccinations. So how can we increase that to make sure that our staff are not going off with sickness? That would be an example. And then general data quality queries we've been looking at as well. So that just gives you a flavour of the additional work that we've been doing that will help prepare us for that final submission. So those figures that you've seen there will change when we get into our next round.
Is that it?
Yes, that's all.
Right. Well, we've had 45 minutes of presentation, so over to you now for questions and comments. Mike Smith.
On the workforce front, I'm not sure how realistic the targets are. So just on bank staff, we're 51% more than the intended position at March 26, and then we're expecting next year to turn that around and be down 12%, which I'm not sure, is that 12% down on where they should have been or where they are actually?
Where they are actually.
Okay, it's a bit more realistic. But then the agency, again, off by 12% this year, but next year needing to go down by 35%. It feels like we're setting ourselves targets that are unachievable, and then next year, say, another unachievable target. How realistic is it?
I think that's one of the questions that we've been looking at when we're going through the key lines of inquiries, and also looking at what projects we've got as part of that process. So bank and agency is something that we are looking at as part of the provider collaborative, and how we can work together to reduce that. So there is a significant amount of challenge that's going back into that. I do anticipate that the final outturn will be slightly different to where we are now. But I can't say what the exact figures are, but there's a number of projects and initiatives that are going on, and certainly that challenge is going back in, not just from ourselves as an ICB, but from our colleagues in NHS England.
David Stout.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jim. I've got three quick questions, if I might. I'll bang them away quickly. The first one is, bearing in mind that providers now provide their plans direct to region, I think you mentioned alignment. And I was going to ask, I think it's the same triangulation. I was going to say, is that working fine, that triangulation process? And I'm particularly thinking with the advent of PBR coming in now, apparently, we need to watch, don't we, that providers don't assume a higher level of income because they're going to do more work, get more PBR, and we're thinking, no, you're not. And I just wonder how that process, are we on top of all of that process now? First question.
So I think, as I intimated in my early remarks, it's challenging because there isn't space for triangulation prior to the ICB final plan submission. So we're relying on informal sharing of intelligence, and we're sympathetic to the fact that our trusts are still working hard to optimise their plan and can't tell us what their plan is before they've decided themselves. We have got a round of alignment stroke triangulation meetings taking place in the next week, where we're having a preemptive conversation. So I wouldn't say it's working optimally. I don't think it's designed necessarily to work optimally. And that's why I think, as I also mentioned, that there may be some further by exception submissions where things haven't landed quite as we anticipated. But what I would say, and this was very much borne out in the meetings that I understand from feedback from Sam, that Sam and Liam attended, is that we're lucky to have some strong and cooperative working relationships within our system, both between the providers and the ICB, and indeed between the ICB and the region. So we've met with regional colleagues and agreed a kind of coordinated approach to working with our providers. We're trying to minimise duplication and share information between all three parties to make that as effective as possible. But I think by design, the process doesn't optimise alignment prior to the submission.
Yeah, thanks for that. I mean, we're doing a work around the system is, whatever the system is, we're doing the best we can. Okay. The plans will keep on developing, I'm sure, between now and, say, March, at the end of the day, if we don't deliver on the 12th of February. How optimistic are you that, in fact, the plans will improve during that process rather than time elapses but they don't actually improve?
So from the soft intelligence that we've got on the performance side, I am anticipating a substantial improvement in how close we are to the ball for the national asks. I think a number of providers are going to submit plans that are compliant with the elective and cancer standards, and others are improving their position. I can't say today that I'm confident that we'll get a clean sweep and all of the plans will be compliant. I think it is extremely challenging, as I mentioned, particularly for the providers who've got the double whammy of the 7% financial challenges, perhaps a triple whammy of underperformance in this year. So I think, I'm pleased with the level of ambition. I don't think it's a lack of level of ambition. I think it is a very challenging.
But it wouldn't be surprising if we actually sit down with the region and some providers further down the process. Yeah, okay. And finance?
So I would expect us to have less organisations that aren't compliant with the finances, without naming any of them. But I think we're still going to be left with a number of organisations, especially those who historically received deficit support funding. I think they're going to find it extremely challenging to put a balanced plan in, because of the scale of cost improvement that we required and the amount of staff that they've managed to be able to achieve in previous years.
And the last question was, we've been focused on what we need to do now by the 12th of February and then by March. But what about our sort of commissioning plan? I mean, will we during the same time scale, have time to develop our commissioning plan rather, to work out what we're going to do, if anything, around left shift next year, demand management if we are vulnerable under PBR, and anything else that we actually need to do, because the same time scale as all of this is the same time scale.
Yes, I think that we're in relatively good shape given the challenging timescales. We did share those commissioning intentions that the board discussed and approved. We have got a developing demand management plan that's got some specific initiatives that we would look to deliver during 26-27, so that's included within the timeline. We have got some left shift initiatives included in the draft plan. For example, we've done a very comprehensive piece of work on locally commissioned services with our general practices, and we're bringing forward a revised plan that includes investment in relation to that, and we are also looking at other left shift initiatives. I didn't mention it in my presentation, I know it's 45 minutes already, but we are also expected, and we haven't yet received the template or the final guidance, to be producing neighbourhood health plans during April, which seems a slightly puzzling timeline and plays to David's comments about this being something of a transition year. So I think we will do quite a significant bit of further work on our left shift ambitions through the medium of those neighbourhood health plans, which are due to be developed in April.
Thank you very much, Joan.
Thank you. Sarah Malik.
Thank you, Chair. Jacqueline, my question really was around the kind of overall strategic system view that we have. And obviously, I know the work done now is focusing on the FT's workforce management, resource allocation and management as well. But I wasn't clear on what risk assessment we had done on the overall system impact, because obviously the demand is not dropping, the demand is increasing for clinical services, but we're almost assuming that by dropping the ability for the trust to provide a greater demand, the overspill has to go somewhere, and the only place I can imagine it goes is to the community. And whilst I appreciate that we have the neighbourhood plans or the planning to kind of accommodate for that, I'm not quite clear what the risks are to us as an ICB or the system in order to address that almost gap that we're finding ourselves looking at.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, as ever with your question, there's a lot in there, and I think, Chair, it might be worth us taking a bit of time as a board to unpack what we mean by demand management. we've coined a local term of intelligent demand management, where we need to be thoughtful and make sure that the initiatives that we put in place are effective for patients, aren't just shifting demand from one place to another or putting them in a kind of third holding space that simply delays referrals from progressing. I think we are developing some intelligent demand management options. For example, we're exploring teledermatology so that we can deal effectively with image capture and review in a way that uses clinical resource productively. So that would be an example. So I think, given we're tight for time, Chair, what I would say is I think it's a really good question and it bears further exploration, but we are very cognizant in terms of the demand management work that we're doing to do things that are effective, not just efficiently moving things, finding ways of just bringing delays into the system or pushing things between sectors. So we're very much aware of that.
Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. The last board meeting, we talked about medium-term plan, and it was raised that there might be some VCSE involvement in the process, and we've had nothing as yet, and we're just a couple of weeks away from submission. I mean, clearly there's been a lot to do, and I would imagine that's played some part in not being able to engage as planned. Is there anything sort of in place to have any discussions or share information with the sector? And just to bring another point in around the integrated neighbourhood health work, it's great that there's going to be more sort of power going to place, but in some of our neighbourhoods there's still not voluntary sector involvement on the sort of the committees, so that's another worry about whole system involvement.
Thanks, Lisa. So I think you're right that this phase of the medium-term financial plan has been very provider trust focused, and that's played out in the planning guidance as well. I think we anticipate that when we do the neighbourhood health plans, that's the kind of appropriate place where we'd have much more deep and meaningful engagement with the voluntary and community social enterprise sector. But I take your point, and we'll take that away and talk about it, that we need to make sure that the arrangements are in place to do that engagement. And as you know, for added complexity, our governance arrangements are also having to be reviewed and changed on the back of the strategic commissioning transition. So there's lots of moving parts, but certainly it's an expectation that there will be VCSE involvement in that development of neighbourhood plans, and we'll take away that challenge to make sure that we've got robust arrangements to ensure that happens in every place.
Tom, did you still want to come in?
My question related to left shift in the interface with neighbourhood plans, so I think it's covered. Thanks, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Sam Allen.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of comments. I think, just firstly, just to remind the board, we just got the guidance for the medium-term plan sort of in November, and obviously it was a very early submission of which we're working through. I do just want to address the second part of the question that we had, Chair, from Keep Our NHS Public North East, which is around transparency and collaboration, and when will users of services have the opportunity to view and comment on the update to the ICB medium-term plan. We will bring the plan back through our public board meeting in March, and that's in line with the way in which we've done planning annually. So there will certainly be the opportunity for full transparency of the plan. Clearly, it's just too early to be able to share any further information, and certainly the information that our Chief Finance Officer and Chief Strategy Officer have shared today is all of the information actually that is currently available at this particular point in time. And indeed, as Jacqueline's reference, we've approved our commissioning intentions as a board as well, and the basis of the ICB plan is very much on the commissioning intentions that we signed off. I did just want to mention the point about left shift, because I do think, Chair, this is probably something we need to capture through our board assurance framework as a potential significant risk. I would like to think we are...
You would need to explain left shift.
So the left shift would be taking money moving money out of more secondary based hospital services or investment, or shifting it into primary and community care services, or a left shift, which is new investment. Instead of going right to the hospitals, it goes left straight away. I would still like to think that we are able to commit to some level of left shift. Having said that, with the scale of the financial risks across the system, there is obviously inevitably a risk that some of our planning may be delayed in order to do that. But the left shift and investing in the kind of alternatives hospital is a fundamental plank of the 10-year health plan, and it's really important that we do make progress against that. So I would say to the board, when we are back, when we're considering the sign off of the plan in February, and when we bring it back to our public board meeting in March, we should be include more detailed information, particularly around the investment in the left shift that we're able to do.
Claire Riley.
Thanks, Chair. Just in response to what Lisa asked about the voluntary and community sector, and aligned to what Jacqueline says, Lisa, you'll know that I did a session with your voluntary and community sector programme board, didn't I? And I shared with you the importance of those neighbourhood relationships and how actually the shift is moving. So I think that very much aligns to what Jacqueline said.
Just finally, David, I want to just check my understanding of the block deconstruction, this technical term. So it is a requirement, though the pace of it can be variable around the country.
Absolutely, that's my understanding. So
yeah. Okay. Yeah.
To a maximum, subject to affordability.
Right, and there will be gainers and losers, and in general terms, in our part of the world, it will mean moving money from the south of the region to the north.
To keep it nice and simple, that wouldn't be an unfair summarisation.
Okay, thank you very much. So obviously we need a full discussion when the figures are starting to emerge. Thank you. Right, we've finished on that. We've dealt with questions from the public, although we will give a written answer to the question that we were discussing, and there is no other business. Date of the next meeting, Tuesday 31st of March, and if I could now request a short session in private just to discuss